Hope you enjoyed that powerful intro. The Red Army Choir singing the Soviet national anthem. I'm sure for some of you it sent shivers down your spines. Anyway, back once again by unpopular demand, SIGCAST, AP Euro, Chapter 25. What we do now is we embark on the Russian Revolution and the emergence of, yes, Soviet Russia. So a little intro. We're going to talk about the emergence of the Bolsheviks here and, just kind of pick up where we left off. World War I hastened. It sped up the collapse of the Tsarist regime in Russia. And by the end of 1916, Russia was no longer capable of sustaining military operations against the Central Powers. The economy was a mess. It was in shambles, and the power of the government was pretty much no longer existence. And in March of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II would abdicate. And the new provisional government failed to establish its effective control over the country. And in November, there was another revolution led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they took power. And it began their effort to create the world's first communist society. Following Lenin's death in 1924, we'll go over this more in Chapter 26, but Joseph Stalin gradually established his authority over the Soviet Union and implemented his 5-year plans in 1928. And Stalin sought to reorganize the country's economy and eliminate capitalism and promote the development of heavy industry and collectivization of agriculture. Stalin's rule would be marked by the events of the Great Purge and the dictator's attempt to eliminate any possible opposition to his authority. So, the national collapse, war and revolution. For Russia, as we've said, it was a mess. World War I had brought up so many of the deficiencies of not the politics, but also the economy of Russia. Russia's backward agriculture and underdeveloped industry, transportation, and communication lines, it couldn't really sustain a major war effort, let alone the military and technological demand for total war, the total war that you've read about in the earlier parts of Chapter 25 regarding the First World War. And in autumn of 1915, Tsar Nicholas II took personal command of his army, leaving the government in the hands of his wife, the Empress Alexandra. This was not really the brightest idea in the grand Tsar scheme of things. First, the Tsars had been treading water with the Russian people. Synthesis alert. Think back to Alexander II, the people's will, his assassination, and the repression of Alexander III that ensued, and his son, Nicholas II. Let's remember the 1905 embarrassment of the Russians at the hand of the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, and let's not forget the fact that that led to Bloody Sunday. Second, the second reason why this wasn't a very wise choice is the Tsar had very little military training, if any, to take over such a daunting task. In fact, this was darn near impossible, and he assumed naively enough that his mere presence would fire up the Russians, the troops, and bring home a big W for the Russian people. Think again, Nikki. Didn't go down that way. And by 1917, the Russian will had basically vanished. Their will to fight, gone. And as the situation worsened both militarily and domestically in Russia, Nicholas II increasingly cut himself off from the influences outside of his immediate family or military headquarters. Mainly his wife, Alexandra, a German princess, had basically made sure that the Tsar was kind of left in the dark about many items. Again, this is in the reading. This too is on the quiz. So it was kind of her doing that he wasn't really up to speed on the affairs domestically in his country. And in fact, Alexandra was counseled and came under the influence of an unscrupulous, self-proclaimed holy man who supposedly had the mystical power to stop the bleeding of the Tsar's hemophiliac son, Alexei. And again, this Alexei, this heir to this hemophiliac son, I had trouble saying that word, was the next in line, the heir to the throne, if you will. All right, and as this gentleman's name, this unscrupulous, self-proclaimed holy man, his name was Rasputin. And as Rasputin's power grew, the prestige of the Tsarist regime suffered. The people believed that this outsider, Rasputin, was really running the government, running the show, even though that wasn't the case. But on the outside, that's what it looked like. And thus, that he was more, bringing more blame to the throne and the ruling family for Russia's deficiencies. Not to mention, while his focus was on the war, as I mentioned earlier, and again, I'm double mentioning this because it's a quiz question, just saying, Tsar Nicholas was kept in the dark about the domestic turmoil by Tsarina Alexandra. She essentially kept him ignorant of all the problems so he could worry about the war and wouldn't worry also about this kind of creepy guy that was living back home in the palace named Rasputin. Again, ultimately, she wanted him to heal her ailing son. And in December of 1916, a group of conservative conspirators who had close and personal ties to the imperial family decided they were going to murder Rasputin. They were desperately trying to save the reputation of the regime and desperately trying to preserve the old order. All right, and again, the Tsarist regime. The removal of one man, however, could not reverse the damage that had already been done, and it was apparent that Russia and its government's collapse was imminent. Now, I know you're going to have trouble reading this, but this is a little story. If you want to read about the crazy death of Rasputin, pause the lesson right here and just read it. It's nuts. All right, and again, I think what I have to do is I have to make it a little bit bigger so you could see the whole thing. But if you've ever seen the Disney movie Anastasia, this is actually kind of depicted in there, but it is nuts. Okay, I hope if you paused it, you enjoyed the interesting story of the death of Rasputin, or the murder, I should say, of Rasputin. And if you just skipped it all together, that's cool too. All right, but let's talk about the end of the Tsarist regime. And as if the strife in the ruling dynasty, the distrust of government, and the staggering wartime losses and the runaway inflation weren't enough, the government had imposed rationing of bread by February of 1917. By March, it was met with spontaneous strikes and demonstrations. The unrest swept across and swept into the Russian capital of Petrograd, formerly known as St. Petersburg. And on March 8th, 10,000 Petrograd women marched through the city demanding peace and bread. Kind of reminds you of the Women's March to Versailles in the French Revolution. And again, spontaneously, other workers joined the Women's March and called for a general strike in Petrograd, which effectively shut down all factories in the capital by March 10th. Now again, Nicholas ordered troops to go in and disperse the protesters by force if necessary. But the situation had slipped out of control, and as I said, this was spontaneous. And what ends up happening is a lot of Nicholas's troops actually join the protesters. They don't like what's going on with the war effort, and they see that there is no end in sight to the suffering and struggle. So Tsar Nicholas II remains in the capital, and on March 12th, the Duma, which by the way the Tsar had dissolved, they decide to meet anyway, and they elect a committee to represent its interests. And as the chaos ensues, Tsar Nicholas II further orders the troops once again, hey, suppress the demonstrations, and they disobey their orders. And the troops, again, as I mentioned, will join the demonstrators. And on March 15th, the Tsar sees what's going on, and he abdicates. And after 300 years of ruling Russia, the power of the Romanovs is gone. It collapses. Now, in 1917, Russia still uses the Julian calendar, which in the 20th century was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar. So by the Julian calendar, the disturbances in Petrograd intensified in late February. And for that reason, the revolution is often referred to as the February Revolution in Russia, even though with the rest of the West, it was in March. So that's where you get, in some cases, the February and March Revolution, and as well the October and the November Revolutions, and we'll talk about those coming up. So once the Tsar's regime, when he abdicates and it collapses, he sets up, or not he sets up, Russia sets up what we know as a provisional government, a temporary government. You got to have government. And so the Duma that we mentioned, that committee became Russia's political or provisional government, and it was headed by Prince George Lvov, a liberal nobleman. Another gentleman named Alexander Kerensky, who was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, was the only socialist to serve in the liberal-dominated government. This provisional government was mostly under the control of the middle class and liberal-minded aristocrats. Okay? So again, upper wealthy middle class, the business class, and then the liberal-minded aristocracy. So the ups, the haves, not the have-nots. And in fact, these people had little contact or sympathy with the problems of the workers or the peasants. They promised reforms and announced a plan for election of a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution for Russia that would be a democratic republic. Their goal was to move the nation toward democracy while continuing the war as a loyal Western ally in World War I. Essentially, why they wanted to do this was to uphold Russia's honor with those Western nations. It's this very continuation of World War I that is going to be the undoing of the provisional government. While all of this was taking place, a new political force was emerging at this time, and it was called the Marxist Social Democrats. And they had two factions. One, you had the Mensheviks, led by Alexander Kerensky himself. Now, the Mensheviks, this is very important, wanted a mass electoral socialist party modeled on socialist parties in Western Europe, essentially adopting the gradual evolutionary socialism that we've talked about that was pretty much espoused by Edward Bernstein. Now, Kerensky and his socialist followers believed that before major reforms could take place, they had to go through the bourgeoisie revolution phase like France had, like Great Britain had, etc., and give the wealthy middle class the chance to revolutionize the backward economy in Russia and really bring them into the 20th century. The other faction, the Bolsheviks, led by exiled Vladimir Lenin, was a smaller faction dedicated to bringing about the overthrow of capitalism through violent revolution now, immediately. Don't wait. In other words, the Mensheviks were more gradual. The Bolsheviks said, let's do this right now. Okay, so in other words, skip the bourgeoisie revolution and in the industrialization part. Just modernize and industrialize now with the communists leading the way. And this is often termed Leninism. Also, the creation of something called the Soviets. In the meantime, workers, soldiers, and sailors in Petrograd, who were responding to a call issued by socialist leaders, elected the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. The Soviet is a Russian word for council. So they basically were taking control of the city and local governments, somewhat like the Zemstvos were established under the reform-minded Alexander II. Although the Petrograd Soviet was controlled by members of the various socialist parties, it gave initial basic support to the provisional government, and similar Soviets were established in other Russian cities and other Russian towns. So, as we mentioned, the Bolshevik program, we're going to dive into this a little bit more and really get into a focus of who this guy, Vladimir I. Lenin, was. So, in April of 1917, Vladimir I. Lenin, the leader of the radical Marxist group, as we've talked about, known as the Bolsheviks, returned to Petrograd from his exile in Switzerland. German high command, who hoped to create further disorder in Russia and hopefully get Russia to pull out of the war so they would no longer have to fight a two-front war, shipped Lenin and a small group of his ardent followers back into Russia in a sealed train by way of Finland. Soon after his arrival, he presented his program that became known as the April Theses. You need to know the April Theses. And to his Bolshevik followers, he presented this April Theses. And what he did was he urged them to push for that proletarian socialist revolution. Now, Lenin outlined the Russian move towards socialism as we said, not gradual. In fact, he called for all power to the Soviets, those councils. In other words, screw the provisional government and Alexander Kerensky. He wanted this revolution to be led by the soldiers, the workers, the peasants, and he wanted them all to join as one big unhappy mob that would instigate his radical change, his radical reform now. He was an agitator, and Lenin felt that the Bolsheviks should oppose the provisional government and support this theme of all power to Soviets. Again, forget about the middle-class revolution that a lot of people thought needed to happen first. He wanted the World War to become a revolution, not just in Russia, but all over the world against capitalism. And he wanted Russia to lead the way. With all the soldiers on both sides, he envisioned, would join the struggle. All the powers, all the soldiers from Germany, all the soldiers from France, all the soldiers from everywhere that were upset with what was going on. He thought, this was our time. This is our time to make Marx's dream a reality. He also called for the nation's factories and banks to be nationalized, and the Bolshevik Party to call itself the Communist Party. And initially, Lenin was rejected, and many Bolsheviks and other socialists just called simply for peace, land, and bread, an end to the war, the confiscation of land of the great landowners, and its redistribution to the peasants, and seizure of food for the cities. They wanted minor reforms to take care of their initial needs, their starvation, not this huge communist revolutionary ordeal that was going to spread worldwide. They thought it was too radical and, quite honestly, a little bit too far-fetched. Now, we need to go. Where did Lenin get these ideas? How did this, come about? Well, first of all, we need to look at his youth and his early career. His dad was a provincial director, and he was born in Simbirsk, a town on the Volga River east of Moscow, and his father was the director of the province. His older brother, Alexander, was involved in a conspiracy that we learned about to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The plot was uncovered before it could be carried out, and Alexander was executed in 1887. Lenin attended the University of Kazan briefly, but was expelled for participating in a student demonstration. Shocking, I know. He studied law on his own, and by the mid-1890s he passed a law examination. More interested in Marxism than really practicing law, Lenin became involved in radical activities in St. Petersburg. He was arrested and imprisoned and then exiled to Siberia. And in 1900, he went into exile in Western Europe. There he published a Russian-language Marxist newspaper called the Iskra, also known as the Spark, which was smuggled illegally into Russia. And, in 1898, a group of Russian Marxists established the Social Democratic Party, kind of like we talked about in Germany. But when the Russian Social Democrats met in London in 1903, Lenin and his followers became known as the Bolsheviks, or a word that means in Russian the majority, even though they weren't. And they split. This is where that split occurs in 1898 with the more moderate Russian Marxists, the Mensheviks. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, again, insist that party membership should be restricted to an elite group of committed revolutionaries. We're going to call that the Politburo. But the Bolsheviks also believed that the party should press for the proletarian revolution in Russia at an earlier date rather than wait for the Russian industrial capitalism to achieve its mature level of development. By 1905 and into 1917, as we said, Lenin was in exile. He was surprised by the February Revolution. However, with the aid of those Germans, he and some of his followers were placed on a sealed train, transported into Switzerland, from Switzerland into Russia, to actually go through and participate in this uprising. Now, the policies of the provisional government in the meantime, let's talk about these, because obviously they're going to fail to give the Russian people what they want. While the Russian provisional government recognized the peasants' need for more land, it also respected the rights of private property. Again, remember, some of these people, the Mensheviks in particular, still want this gradual move towards revolution, and they want to allow the business leaders in the middle class to keep progressing so they could bring Russia into modernity, so to speak, economically. So therefore, the government was not prepared to authorize the confiscation of the land that many of the masses wanted, nor was it willing to seize food to meet the demands of the cities. The provisional government also wanted to continue the war against, as we said, the Central Powers, and many in the government felt that the government had to stay in the war in order to maintain international credibility and international respect. And in July 1917, the Russian army launched an offensive against the Austrians in Galicia on the Eastern Front due to Allied pressure. However, the offensive was quickly a fiasco. It collapsed. And what happens is many of the Russian soldiers will desert, and the army begins to collapse. And here is a picture of the Russian soldiers running from the Germans. And again, they're ill-equipped. It's not like they're wusses. They don't have the means necessary to do a good job. So then we get into yet another July days. We learned about the July Revolution and the July Ordinances in 1830 in France with Louis Philippe getting in and rebelling against Charles. But even before the news of the fiasco in Galicia reached Petrograd, the July Days insurrection broke out. The July Days represented a spontaneous revolt against the unpopular now provisional government. The leader of the provincial government steps down as prime minister over the land question and their inability to solve that problem. So what you had was Alexander Kerensky becoming prime minister, and he announces elections for a new constituent assembly. And most of the leaders of Petrograd Soviet opposed the insurrection, believing it was premature. Although Lenin shared this view, the Bolsheviks nevertheless supported the July Days, and when the insurrection was suppressed, Lenin had to flee back to Finland to escape arrest. Other Bolshevik leaders had to go underground and flee elsewhere after leading the demonstrations of more than 500,000 protesters. In the short run, the Bolsheviks were weakened by their support of this revolt. But in the long run, the July Days were crucial because the position won the Bolsheviks many new followers among the increasingly more desperate and radical workers, soldiers, and sailors of the capital. And this change in leadership from Lvov to Kerensky did little to strengthen the provisional government. You had another additional ordeal, and this reminds me of the Boulanger crisis that happened in France, if you remember that from chapter 24. Kerensky held meetings in Moscow in 1917 with the people representing the old Duma, the military, the Soviets, the professions, and other groups to come up with a constituent assembly. In essence, Kerensky's trying to get everybody to work together. And the Bolsheviks, because they don't want everybody to work together, opposed this meeting. And they had the workers respond with a general strike, trying to shut everything down. And the meeting demonstrated the growing differences between Kerensky and the conservatives. Remember, Kerensky was a Menshevik. He was a socialist. And the conservatives are the old Tsarist regime. And they looked at the provisional government's commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, as the true leader. Usually the conservatives do side with the military. So General Kornilov represents elements who decried the collapse of military discipline, Russian troops fleeing against the Germans. And Kornilov and the conservatives were certain that Kerensky didn't have the ability to restore order and stability to Russia or the army. So Kerensky has Kornilov dismissed. But Kornilov responds by ordering some of his troops to march to Petrograd to stop a Bolshevik coup and establish a military dictatorship over Russia. And with the help of the Bolsheviks, who now control the Petrograd Soviet, the provisional government was able to turn back the threat and save the revolution and the new government. So if you just take a step back and think of what I just said, the provisional government was saved by the help of the Bolsheviks, and it gives them instant street cred, if you will. So the Kornilov affair serves to weaken the provisional government. It helps legitimize further the Bolshevik power, and they became what people perceived as the only faction in Russia that could defeat the conservative old guard and still yet restore order and sensibility. And again, the same thing will happen in Italy and Germany, just saying. They'll turn to the brown shirts, they'll turn to the black shirts for order. People want order. The November Revolution is the next stage of this progression. The Kornilov affair and Kerensky's failure to rebuild support for the provisional government convinces the Bolshevik two leaders, Lenin and Leon Trotsky, that it's time to seize power. And in late October, Lenin orders his followers to begin the plans. Lenin returns from Finland to meet with the party's central committee to plan a coup. And though there was much disagreement and opposition to the plan, the committee agreed to create a political bureau, also known as the Politburo, to oversee the revolution. And on the night of November 6th and 7th, the Red Guard, an armed force organized by the Petrograd Soviet and led and organized by Leon Trotsky, seizes key strategic locations in the city. And by the Julian calendar, it was October 24th and 25th. And even today, the Soviets refer to the great socialist October Revolution. Kerensky, who was well informed of Lenin's actions, finally decided to move against the plotters on November 6th. And in response, Lenin and Trotsky ordered their supporters to seize the city's transportation and communication centers, shut them down, general strike style. The Winter Palace was captured that evening, along with most of Kerensky's government. There was an attempt to have a second Congress or Constituent Assembly with moderates and the radicals working together. However, because the Bolsheviks dominated the new Congress even though technically the Bolsheviks were in the minority. The fact is, many moderate socialists who didn't like Lenin and didn't like Trotsky walked out. And so in essence, what Lenin's coup did was it left Bolsheviks in total control of this new assembly. That's why you can't quit, all right? Essentially, by walking out, the moderates gave the radicals what they wanted, total control. Lenin used this new rump Congress, again, without opposition. Remember the rump parliament after Pride's Purge in England that established Oliver Cromwell as the supreme commander and the protector of England? Again, shout out to chapter 15 there, a little synthesis alert for y'all. But anyway, he uses this new rump Congress to launch his new regime. And on November 7th, Lenin announces the establishment of a new regime which bore the revolutionary name of the Council of People's Commissars. In all, the November Revolution was an armed takeover of the capital. So, on November 7th, Lenin announces the establishment of a new regime which bore the revolutionary name, as I said in the last slide, the Council of People's Commissars. Lenin served as the council's chairman, while Leon Trotsky became the Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and Joseph Stalin was the Commissars for Nationalities. In other major cities and towns, the Bolsheviks also took control, although the fighting continued in Moscow for several days. While the Bolsheviks had seized power with relative ease and little violence, their government now confronted immense problems. And this is a scary picture. Some of the most controversial men, and some people might say evil men, that the world has ever seen. So let's talk about the early measures of the Bolshevik regime. Following the November Revolution, Lenin and his followers sought to realize the Bolshevik vision of a new socialist society, and the government urged the conclusion of an immediate peace. Initially, it called upon the peasants to seize landowners' land and the workers to take control of the factories. So once they were in power, they ratified the redistribution of land that in many cases had already been seized by the peasants. They also issued some reform laws. Regarding the Russian Orthodox Church, they saw this as a reactionary or conservative institution, so the Bolsheviks sought to destroy it. Much like we've seen talking about the Third Republic in France, or when we talked about the Reign of Terror and the de-Christianization policies of Robespierre. The church and state were separated, church property was seized, and many churches, monasteries, and convents were closed. Religious instruction prohibited, and only civil marriage ceremonies held any legal recognition. You couldn't get married in a church. The Bolsheviks replaced the Julian calendar with the Gregorian calendar and simplified the Cyrillic alphabet. And the titles of the nobility were abolished. Now, the Constituent Assembly further goes into action here, and prior to its overthrow, the provisional government had scheduled elections for this Constituent Assembly to be held in November. Well, Lenin's government decided to allow these elections to be held, but the results were disappointing for the Bolsheviks. Although the Bolsheviks were seeing increasing support in Russia City, the country still remained overwhelmingly rural, and the Socialist Revolutionary Party had a large following among the peasants. Some 420 social revolutionaries were elected, and again, these are the more moderates, into the Constituent Assembly, while the Bolsheviks only won about 225 seats. And in January of 1918, the Constituent Assembly met in Petrograd, and the Bolsheviks dissolved it after only one session. Lenin also organized a secret police force known by its Russian acronym, the Cheka, to combat counter-revolutionary activity. So again, they seized power when they gave power to the people to basically come up with a parliament or a constituent assembly. The Bolsheviks were on the outside looking in. So what did they do? They just decided to take power by force. And again, we'll see this happen in Germany. The Cheka carried out the policy of the so-called Red Terror with its mass killings, executions of hostages, coercion, and sadistic torture were all part of this. It was notorious for its repressions in the Ukraine in 1918 through 1920, particularly in the cities during the retreat of the Red Army and during every new occupation. In 1920 to 1922, the Cheka fought Ukrainian insurgents and terrorized Ukrainian peasants. It destroyed the nationally conscious Ukrainian intelligentsia, particularly members of the Ukrainian political parties. Again, Ukraine didn't want to be part of this Bolshevik revolution, and as you can see, it's just horrific. This was what the Soviets did. This is what the Bolsheviks did. This is what they represented in many cases. And by dissolving the Constituent Assembly and establishing this secret police force, Lenin began the process of creating a Bolshevik dictatorship to replace the autocracy of the czars. And again, these pictures above are Ukrainian victims of the Cheka. In many cases, these are Ukrainian monks. Just a disgusting thing. Anyway, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, okay? Negotiations between Lenin's government and the Germans led to the signing of a treaty in March of 1918 known as Brest-Litovsk. Believing that it was impossible for Russia to continue the war, Lenin insisted that there was no alternative other than accepting harsh terms dictated by the Germans. In any event, he reasoned, the world revolution would soon engulf Germany too, and the treaty would be null and void. So, in many ways, he thought he was getting one over on the Germans. The treaty forced the Russians to give up Finland, Russian Poland, and the Baltic areas of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, part of Belarusia and part of the Ukraine and Transcaucasia. The treaty was nullified, like Lenin said, following the Allies' defeat of the Germans later in 1918. However, I will say this, that worldwide communist revolution didn't happen. The Civil War that ensued, the November Revolution had been quite unexpected, and it caught, I should say, the Bolsheviks' opponents off balance. But by spring of 1918, however, these opponents recovered their poise and begun the effort to topple the Bolshevik Leninist regime. During the Civil War, this is known as the Red versus Whites, the Bolsheviks, who began to call themselves communists, had certain advantages. They dominated the heart of the country and held much of Russia's remaining industry because they controlled cities under their control. Their lines of communication and supply were relatively short. Furthermore, Leon Trotsky, who served as the Commissar for War, succeeded in creating an effective fighting force that we know as the Red Army. And on the other hand, the anti-communist forces, known as the Whites, failed to coordinate their efforts. There was too much division internally due to the size of Russia, and there were opposing views of liberalism and socialism. On this side, you actually had conservatives, you had socialists, you had liberals, and also nationalism kind of tore apart the Whites' efforts. Furthermore, many Russians feared that a White victory would mean a restoration of the old order. Nevertheless, the Whites took control over the large areas of Russia, and by July of 1918, the White forces approached the Ural mountain town of Ekaterinburg. Local communists ordered the murder of the former Tsar and his family to prevent their rescue of the Whites. As it looked like the Whites were winning, they might be able to rescue the Tsar and his family. And what the Russian revolutionaries believed was, look, if you don't want the Tsarist regime to ever come back, you kill them all. And during the 1919-1920, the Reds gradually will defeat the major White commanders. All right, and again, I could read you those commanders' names, but I won't be able to pronounce them anyway. Okay, so it looked like by 1920, it looked like the Whites might actually lose. And so the Allies decided to get involved. We have Allied intervention in the Civil War, and it proved to be of limited significance. French, British, American troops were sent to Russia to prevent the Germans from seizing stockpiles of new raw materials. This is called the Archangel expedition, while the Japanese intervened in eastern Siberia. While the Allies provided some assistance to the White forces, they didn't fully commit themselves to the war effort to overthrow Lenin's regime. And nonetheless, the Soviets did not forget that the Westerners' invasions of Russia and interference in this civil war. Again, even though they didn't throw their full support behind the White forces, they did help them out in some ways. This tension would spill over to the Cold War some 40 years later. Now, Soviet territorial losses. During the Civil War, the Soviets suffered some major setbacks. In the West, we've said, Finland, Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania gained independence, while Romania seized the province of Bessarabia. Independence movement failed, however, in the Ukraine and Georgia and Armenia in the Caucasus. In 1920, Poland invaded Russia. The new Polish state, established by the Treaty of Versailles under Marshal Joseph Pilsudski, sought to take advantage of the Russian Civil War and retake territory lost to Russia during the Polish partitions of the late 18th century. Polish forces invaded the Ukraine on April 25th and took Kiev 2 weeks later. The Soviets' counteroffensive reached Warsaw by mid-August, but was stopped by the Poles. Both sides concluded an armistice by October that placed Poland's border east of the Curzon line. The new Polish state, established by the Treaty of Versailles, as we said, I just kind of talked about in this last. Here's that line that we talked about. So they were able to essentially come up with a peace treaty. But again, we know that there's tension between Poland and the Soviet Union. There's going to be tension between Poland and Germany. It's a new state. It came out of nowhere after the Treaty of Versailles, self-determination. The League of Nations is going to work to try to preserve, but as we know, it's going to be in Poland. Why am I talking about Poland so much? Well, yeah, I'm part Polish, but it's going to be the invasion of Poland in September of 1939 that begins World War II. All right, and again, why? There's a treaty between Germany, Hitler, and Stalin of Russia called the Non-Aggression Pact, which allows the Germans and the Russians to once again partition Poland. So stay tuned for that. Okay, almost done here, boys and girls. War communism is also in the book, and you need to know it. In order to provide more food for the Russian cities, in the Soviet government implemented something called war communism. It's a program that's centered on forced grain seizures, forcing seizures of agricultural crops, and class war between the kulaks. Now, the kulaks, you read, it's an ill-defined middle-class peasant, all right? And they're kind of seen as enemies of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so the major industries, as well as banks and insurance companies, were all nationalized. Private trade was prohibited, and the regime requisitioned food from the peasants in order to feed the city. So they're going after these kulaks. They're taking their wealth. They're taking, if they're kulak farmers, they're taking all of their crops and they're redistributing it to the Russian people. Again, we've said that some of the Western nations, like Britain, like France, and even in the United States, kind of took control of some of the industries, but this is a total takeover, and this is going to lead to tension with the kulaks a little bit later. And then there's the Supreme Economic Council, which supervised the operations and ran the Russian economy. All right, the Civil War and war communism brought economic disaster and social upheaval throughout the country. Agriculture and industrial production sharply declines. The transportation and communication systems collapse, and the cities experience increasingly more serious shortages of food and fuel. So it looks like disaster for the Bolsheviks. A lot of people in Russia are saying, let's get these people out of here. Then you had the Kronstadt Rebellion in 1921. And again, this is dealing with the Civil War. Soon after the Civil War, we talked about war communism and mounting Russian discontent erupts. And on March 1st, 1921, as Soviet leadership met to decide on policies to guide the nation in peace, a naval rebellion broke out in the Kronstadt naval base near Petrograd. This was an especially shocking occurrence since the Kronstadt sailors had been long ardent supporters of Lenin and the communists. But they didn't like the way things were going. They didn't like the dictatorship, and the Soviet leadership sent Trotsky to Kronstadt and his Red Army to put down the rebellion, which they brutally did on March 18th. So, this discontent, it freaked Lenin and it freaked the Bolsheviks out. So what your book talks about, you need to know this, is an NEP, the New Economic Policy. Lenin recognized, and the Bolsheviks needed to change things a little bit. So they did in March of 1921 with a new economic policy. The NEP brought partial restoration of capitalism, which Lenin justified as one step backward that would make possible 2 steps forward later. Again, you might be confused by this, but he's kind of relenting a little bit to the Menshevik faction. And under the NEP, the state retained ownership and control of large industries, the so-called commanding rights of industry. The state also controlled transportation and foreign trade, but smaller industries were turned over to private operators and cooperatives, and private retail trade was permitted. Believing that it was easier for us to change our policy than it is to change the peasant, Lenin ended the requisitioning of food. A tax in kind payable in grain was levied on the peasants, who could then sell their surplus produce on the open market and make a better profit. This provided the peasants with an incentive to produce more food. The peasants were also permitted to rent additional land to hire labor. concessions were granted to foreign capitalists as well, so that Russia could get the technological expertise it needed to carry out its economic recovery. Under the NEP, the Russian economy revived. By 1927, it had generally regained the level of 1913, finally recovering from the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and the Red and White Civil War. The country remained dominated by small farms and peasant communes, but industrial production also improves, although it was handicapped by outdated technology and equipment, which would further hinder output and expansion beyond the 1913 levels. That's where Joseph Stalin will take over. And that's where we'll pick up in chapter 26. So welcome to the new world age of the 20th century, in which there is a communist government that also has the idea and the goal to spread communism to elsewhere. All right? Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy your break.